Ayn Rand, I don't like Ayn Rand. But one thing that happened to Ayn Rand that was very transformative for her way of thinking was she came from Soviet Russia, and she wrote a play. And in the play, it's sort of making fun of the bureaucratic control that she experienced in the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And it was widely panned by critics. Not because it was like badly written or something like that, but rather because all of the critics and all of the magazines were like, that couldn't possibly be happening in the Soviet Union, which we know is a progressive state that we should be emulating here in America.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
All right, well, welcome to Diet Soap, the longest podcast on the left, the longest lasting podcast on the left. It doesn't last that long per episode. I'm Douglas Lane, the host, and of course with me today is Comrade Wyatt, without his hat. Comrade, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I mean, do I need an introduction still, or does
the movie hasn't come out,
ex-platypus member, movie star, and deranged right-wing conservative. You think that works, Doug, for the description?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you're really right-wing. We'll figure that out eventually. But
I don't think so either. But
yeah. So all right. So today we're going to be talking about the history of American conservatism, I think.
Yeah.
And try to put those right-wingers in historical context, giving people on the left a better understanding of the so-called opposition. And that's where we should maybe just dive right in. But I do want to mention and make a plug that Wyatt is one of the stars of the last election. There was a trailer that was dropped yesterday, or maybe the day before, on the channel. And people should check it out. It will be screening at NYU on the 20th from 5 to 8. I think it's the tea and breakfast room that it's going to be at. But yeah, take a look for the trailer. I will put a link to it in the description for this video. And I hope to see you there if you are a native to New York. But Wyatt, what is American conservatism? How did people in America start to define themselves as conservatives, and what does it mean in the context of the United States?
I don't believe there was really a conservative movement until we get to the beginnings of the crisis of the Gilded Age. Probably we could locate it around the 1880s. You start seeing things like the Bourbon Democrats, who are defining themselves as, maybe if not conservatives, laissez-faire, very strictly sort of laissez-faire capitalists, free markets, gold standard, etc. So you start to see it a little then. Then in what I call the crisis of 1912, which is the 1912 election. Everyone who opposed Roosevelt and Wilson and voted for Taft probably would have defined themselves as conservatives in the sense that A, they want to preserve this sort of laissez-faire federalist system, and B, and this is actually a very important point, they want to preserve the old decentralized political machines, which both Roosevelt as well as Wilson want to break down. So the old political machines, the old Democratic Party political machine, the old Republican Party political machine, they wanted to preserve those. And that actually is very important because that is the old way of reconciling the state, society, and capital in the United States, basically from the crisis of 1848 onwards is through the party system. So the parties mediate between the state and society. Like if you have a problem, you go to your local party, and, you know, for instance, if your house burns down, and your local alderman will set you up with a new house. That was sort of the way things worked, instead of having a massive welfare state or something along those lines. Instead, you have the party system. And that party system went into crisis in the Gilded Age. So conservatives begin to define themselves not just as conservatives in terms of wanting to preserve laissez-faire, wanting to preserve federalism, but also as wanting to preserve the party system. And that actually is very important. And Taft, he loses the election very, very badly. And this is kind of viewed by serious historians of American politics. That actually is a very critical moment in American history that he loses to Wilson. But on the other hand, if you're really serious as a critic of the administrative state, Wilson is less bad than Roosevelt would have been, who is proposing not just a New Deal that was even more extreme than the New Deal, but he was actually proposing crazy things like having judicial decisions be subject to voting. Like anybody could come vote on a judicial decision, which is crazy.
You said at the start there that anyone who was opposed to Wilson or Roosevelt started to define themselves as conservative. But of course, Eugene Debs.
That's not Debsians, yes. And socialists don't. Although, once you get into the New Deal period, which is really when the term conservative sort of really starts to come to be known, you actually do see a substantial number of people who were Debsian socialists become part of what's called the old right. Now, the one thing I will also say that's very important is I personally believe that up until the Civil War, everybody was a utopian socialist in America. I'm not saying they're Marxist. I'm saying that they were some variety or another of either utopian socialist or reactionary socialist. But they would not define themselves as conservatives. They would define themselves as radical in some way. There was not a movement that was, you know, explicitly devoted to not being the vanguard of capital, which is basically what conservatism means. There was no such movement in the United States up until the Gilded Age.
Okay.
That's my tension. There are people, I had a professor who traced it all the way back to Hamilton. He said Hamilton's sort of, Hamilton was a reactionary in many respects. He did believe in hierarchy between human beings. He did not really support egalitarianism. His view of America was very highly influenced by some variety of Christian nationalism. I don't use that word in the modern scare quote sense, that just he literally founded towards the end of his life something like a Christian league or something like that. So Hamilton, you could maybe say, but I still think Hamilton was actually more of like a almost proto-Bonapartist than a conservative, because Hamilton was also vindicated in some ways, in terms of where capital was going.
Right. And so Bonapartism isn't conservative in the American sense.
Well, Bonapartism is the most conservative and the least conservative, right? Because it's simultaneously the vanguard of capital, but it's the vanguard of capital that can never actually overcome itself, right?
Right.
So like a socialist revolution would be Bonapartist, but it would be Bonapartist in a different specific way,
So just to be clear about the terms, so even Hamilton would be maybe a proto-progressive from your perspective. Would that be?
something like that.
So what it means to be conservative in a country born from revolution, one of the historical realities of that is that it doesn't emerge until after the Civil War. That in fact, the country was defined by revolution up until after the Civil War, according to your, including Hamilton, from the beginning.
Including the Confederates, which is going to be a tough pill to swallow, but I would even define the Confederates as attempting, maybe they were wrong, but actually attempting some sort of utopian socialist society, which is part of why utopian socialism is bad. But that there's a kernel of truth to that. So actually, if you go read, I think it's the Louisiana minutes of their secession convention, gets taken over pretty quickly by these like young guys who had been educated in Europe by young Hegelians, actually. Mm-hmm. And the like conservative I'm using in sort of a certain way, but the more conservative sort of landowning class did not want to secede, but they pushed for it very hard, these sort of younger radicals at these conventions.
We're running into some problems because when we try to say, who is what in the past before the Civil War, we end up talking about conservatives when we really ought to be using a different term, right? Yeah. So the revolutionaries are just different, let's say less self-reflexive, less advanced forms of socialists, maybe, more constrained.
Keep in mind, Marxism is not really like a major current in the world of 1860. I mean, there's no right. If you're a socialist, Marxism is one very small sect among many in the world of like 1865. Doesn't mean that it doesn't have impact, but it does mean that like in context, there's actually very little Marxism as in terms of a movement or politics.
The full power of Marxism as an ideology doesn't really reach fruition until after the Russian Revolution, maybe, right?
Yes. Yeah. Let's fast forward a little bit. So I went through the 1912 crisis.
Mm-hmm.
After the 1912 crisis.
So by the way, what brought on that crisis in 1912? Why was it suddenly necessary to chuck Taft and go with Wilson?
Well, it was the crisis of imperialism. It's the same crisis that afflicted Europe in World War I. Mm-hmm. It came here too. It's the same crisis in capital. It's the same crisis. It just happened to manifest in America as an electoral crisis that didn't actually really lead to war until 1918. Mm-hmm. For the most part, though, it was an electoral crisis here. And what it meant was the old parties, the two parties, the Jacksonian Democratic Party, and which at the time was the party of the South and urban white ethnics. Mm-hmm. And then the Republican Party, which was the party of, let's call them Midwestern white ethnics. So it was really strong in Ohio. And it was the party of industry, high industry. And then the Democrats were the party of low tariff, which at the time, this gets confusing today for people, but in 1912, it wasn't confusing. But high tariffs were something working class people did not like.
There may be some sentiment in that direction even now.
Today.
Yeah.
Maybe the Democrats as the low tariff states' rights party could come back. Who knows? But then, okay, so we get to the crisis of 1912. Mm-hmm. Taft is gone. We have Wilson. Wilson gets us into World War I grudgingly, I will note. Wilson actually campaigned against going into World War I. And by all accounts, Wilson did not want to do an intervention into World War I. whereas Roosevelt actually did want to do an intervention immediately into World War One. But anyways, we have Wilson. Wilson creates the modern administrative state as we know it. Although, I do think it's kind of unfair to say like Wilson is like Mr. Evil or something, because he's creating the administrative state to address a real crisis in capital. He's not just some guy. He is an academic, but he's not that. Like, his thing is not to make the most expansive administrative state. He made actually a pretty mild one compared to what we have.
But it was pretty dramatic at the time, and
It was,
and he wrote about it. Yeah, he wrote about it in 1880 or so. He wrote his essay on administration and the need for the professionalization or the development of a technocratic elite, basically back then.
Yeah, because at the time, what was coming into crisis was something called the spoils system. It operated since the Second Revolution of 1800, Jefferson's Revolution, where civil service jobs are given to party members. So that was coming into crisis. And so you have civil service reform comes to the forefront. And from there, the other thing that's coming into crisis is the parties can no longer mediate between society and the state as society becomes more and more complex. So if you're an alderman, you have so many more things you have to do than just like make sure that the old lady whose house burned down has a nice place to stay. You can't just do that anymore. So that's also coming into crisis because, you have factories polluting the river. You might have other things, right? So that's all coming into crisis.
Right. And so that's why the conservatives are today associated with basically being a force to hold on to old forms of power and wealth, is because the spoil system was seen as being kind of a racket and corrupt by the time Wilson came along, and those who would defend it are defending almost just their own personal power.
But the irony is the spoil system was considered revolutionary in its time. All the way, Madison, Jefferson, they all agreed the spoil system was a needed thing to have a revolutionary state.
What was the argument for the spoil system back then?
Well, the argument is basically this: if you have a party, your objective as a party should be to have your people in civil service, and you should be able to give them jobs so that they stay in your party, and so they can be people who mediate between the party, the state, and the society they come out of. And so they can participate. And so anybody can rise up through the party ranks and become a state bureaucrat. You don't have to go to Harvard. You don't have to be the most well-educated person. But for those clerical positions, anybody who wants to can go join the party, put in a little work, and then be rewarded with a job. That system's very pro-working class, actually, if you think about it. It doesn't sound so today because, again, this system went into crisis for a reason, and like today it would not work that way, right? It would be nepotism and it would not function very well. But we can get into this.
There's a perception now that getting into Harvard is easier than getting into government through some sort of spoil system.
Yeah.
Right? And so a working class person could really be talented and get ahead and rise above their station through education and discipline. Yeah. And therefore be the best and get into positions of power and authority that way.
Yeah. What's important to know is, so Wilson comes into power. We have 8 years of Wilson.
Mhm.
And then the United States is among the only countries in the world that after World War I reverses course. So we elect Harding and then we elect Coolidge. Harding's controversial because he had a lot of scandals as president.
Mhm.
But overall, Harding and Coolidge are really the first presidents to be considered sort of conservative icons in like a very specific way. And both of them slashed the federal government. I think Coolidge actually slashed it all in half the size of the federal government. And among other things, we have the Roaring Twenties and a lot of wealth creation in that period. And they're sort of these sober-minded, Harding was not always sober, but Coolidge definitely was. Coolidge was like the picture of, sobriety in both lifestyle and government. But they slashed the federal government. And in a way, keep in mind, this is happening at a time when all the other European countries, fascism is beginning to rise. And America is like off on its own tip, reverting back to just being a normal laissez-faire country in a normal time. Everybody thinks joining the war was a mistake. So the Republican Party becomes more, you could call it isolationist. In fact, both parties kind of do at the time.
Mhm.
And then it all comes crashing down in the big meltdown, and we have the Great Depression. Now, this leads to the rise of the New Dealers, who are sort of a cadre of really progressives who had felt almost exiled from American political life the whole 20s. People don't really sort of understand. There was like a whole cadre of these sort of progressive intellectuals who they saw America reverting back to sort of laissez-faire capital in the 1920s. And they thought this was, this meant that they were never going to get power back again. And
what about Hoover? I mean,
Hoover's sort of I just think Hoover was a bad manager of dealing with things. Like Hoover was a fine president. He was one of these, he kind of reminds me of George H.W. Bush, the original Bush, where he's a very good successor president until there's a crisis. Sort of keep things on an even keel. But then when there was a crisis, like it got to absurd points. This might be apocryphal. I don't know if it's actually true, but apparently at one point he was directing, he was telling people his administration was telling people that they should eat armadillos, so they became known as Hoover hogs. Like this was like the extent of how he was going to manage the problem of the Depression. Now, that's a little overstated. He did do a lot more than is commonly noted, but on the other hand, like he was
definitely laissez-faire.
Yeah, he definitely was not leaning towards a permanent New Deal. Something to intervene in the crisis because it was a crisis, but not a permanent thing. Now, interestingly enough, FDR, when he runs for the first time, he actually runs as a relatively laissez-faire Democrat himself. And I think in his second run, after he'd already won and already been implementing some of the New Deal, one of the interesting things that happened is Al Smith, the former Democratic presidential nominee, the Catholic from New York, gives a speech where he actually denounces the progressive cadre in charge of the party as changing the party undermining the party system and the party structure of the Democratic Party, which had these decentralized party machines, and also implementing the New Deal, which he opposed. And there were plenty of Democrats who opposed the New Deal. But the New Deal is really where the conservative movement comes out of, is opposing the New Deal. And from there, you start to get sort of the basic corpus, the sort of canon that every young conservative is handed will start to include people who were we'll start really with those anti-New Dealers. In terms of, so, you'll get people like Albert J. Nock, you'll get people like H.L. Mencken, and then you also get the Southern agrarians, who, I do think are sort of wrongly understood as blood and soil Southern nationalists. I actually argue they were really nostalgics for the older pre-New Deal America. And the actual sort of like agrarianism is sort of like a way to ideologically express their dissatisfaction with the way the New Deal is set up. We have the old right, and the old right opposes the New Deal. That is the sort of basic building block. Second building block is the America First coalition. And I have to go through this before I can get to the John Birch Society, but there is a point to be made there that's interesting. So the basic building block are that anti-New Deal sentiment, as well as the America First movement. America First movement is sort of wrongly today, in my opinion, sold as sort of this like pro-Nazi movement in America. That's entirely not true. Most of the people involved in the America First Committee were not anti-Semitic. Most were, in fact, there were plenty of Jewish members of America First Committee. Most were basically just wanted to return again to the older American laissez-faire system, which was a system of non-intervention. They did not want to see America become a imperialist state. Now, there's some complications with this. There were people who were, pro-Nazi in the America First Committee. But by and large, it's vastly overstated. And it's really sad that that's the historical memory of it.
Whose interests were the American Firsters representing? Like, what part of the United States were they have strongholds? What classes supported them?
They had their biggest strongholds in the Midwest, in the industrial Midwest, among sort of ethnic whites, for my knowledge, and their worst support was in the South. The South was actually very.
Who are the non-ethnic whites, by the way? That would just be the WASPs, and then everyone else.
Yeah, just the WASPs WASPs, and then also sort of the. I don't know am I allowed to use the word peckerwood on your show, but like.
Yeah, you can say that. Now you have to explain what that is.
Yeah.
What the hell is a peckerwood?
Like poor white, but descended basically from the same people as WASPs. So a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, but like the wrong kind of Protestant from the wrong area of Anglodom. Borderers, basically, people from the border regions. So Northern Irish Protestants.
Oh, the Irish, yeah.
Scottish borderers.
Yeah, okay, I get it.
Yeah, like Scottish Irish.
You don't want them around. They
become this sort of mass, and especially in the South and Appalachia, that has, they're not ethnic whites, but they're not WASPs either.
These are my people. I was born in Tennessee, So
Okay, yeah. So you're a Peckerwood, man.
I'm a Peckerwood. I have Peckerwoods in my past. I'm sure.
But okay, yeah. So yeah, it's worst. The America First Committee has very poor reception in the South. In fact, in one of the key ironies, the Ku Klux Klan was very pro World War II. And so were a lot of the segregationist governors. Were very into World War II. They thought it was great. They wanted to kick Germany and Japan's ass. It was really but it was a very big phenomenon in the Midwest.
Okay. Right. And so the conservatives were not for World War II, and they were not aligned with the Klan. The Klan would not have been conservative by this definition at that time.
This is where we run into definitional difficulties, but they were definitely not part of the old right. The Klan was not part of the old right. The Klan was a progressive. The Klan was at first just sort of a resistance organization. I don't say that to say it was good. Leftists will hear that and be like, oh, it's a resistance organization. That means it's good. But it was in the Civil War, in the aftermath of the Civil War, it was a resistance organization. That just is what it was. It was a bad resistance organization that should have been.
Yeah, you and I can agree they were bad.
Yeah,
I'm not going to say the Ku Klux Klan weren't bad, but they weren't conservative in the way that you're defining conservatism.
No, well, okay, so yeah, the first Klan and the second Klan is a progressive organization. Like, it's a prohibitionist organization, very tied into temperance, and that's the Klan that is in America in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s a little bit. This actually gets to an interesting point, which is that FDR expands his powers quite significantly to the point of, obviously, the internment of Japanese Americans, some Italian Americans, and even some German Americans, which was unprecedented at the time. I mean, we had obviously suspension of habeas corpus in the Lincoln years, but the suspension of habeas corpus on the grounds of ethnicity in the United States was unheard of. And then this was allowed. I mean, the internment of Japanese Americans was a real thing. And that was, that's sort of what the America First Committee was trying to prevent. I know that sounds weird, again, to people who've been fed like Man in the High Castle their whole life, which actually is a good book. But nevertheless, the way the America First Committee is sort of in the background is like, oh, well, they were the bad guys. They wouldn't have, but in reality, they were the people who were opposing FDR's concentration camps.
Right.
I mean, this is this trampling of liberty. The important thing is the America First Committee and the anti-New Dealers, the old right, after the war ends, so America is back to being prosperous, but America has never been more progressive. Again, this to modern day leftists and to modern day rightists, this blows their minds. The idea that the post-45 Fordist two-parent home boom is the progressive era, and probably the most progressive era in the United States, just absolutely blows their mind. But it is true. It was the most progressive era. And actually, if you go back to, I think I've talked about this before, but if you go back to Russell Kirk, his book, Conservative Mind, the opening chapter of it is really about how the 1950s are such a disappointment to conservatives. And so it's in this context, conservatism is sort of failing. that you see the rise of what becomes National Review, and eventually William F. Buckley. Buckley is a very interesting character in the context of conservatism because he sort of comes out of nowhere and then acts as a gatekeeper. And what I mean by that is he's not someone who has sort of like it's not as if he went and studied with, under H.L. Mencken, who was sort of a key old right figure. It's not as if he went and did that. Instead, he went and converted to Catholicism at Yale, was upset they don't talk about God, and moves in this rightward direction while he's at Yale, because Yale is at that point just wholly beholden to progressivism. A key point is the fact Buckley was not part of the Robert Taft the Younger campaign for president, in which Robert Taft actually won the primary, but during the convention was not allowed to be the nominee for the Republican Party. Eisenhower was picked. Robert Taft's campaign is where the old right goes to die, both literally and figuratively. The old right that had opposed World War II interventionism, that had opposed the New Deal. It literally dies in the sense that 2 years after, 1 year after Robert Taft is basically told he won't be the nominee, he dies, literally dies. And this is a very pivotal moment because Robert Taft is somewhat pragmatic. He supported public housing in the United States, but he was an anti-New Dealer. He opposed the cartelization of goods that had been imposed by the New Deal. And he had opposed the cartelization of labor. If anyone's an actor who's watching this, you probably know Taft well, because the only way you can get a SAG card, a Screen Actors Guild card, is through legislation that Taft actually made that mandated that unions basically be able to admit new members. Up until that point, the New Deal had actually made it very, very, very difficult if you had to join a union, for you to join that union. It was really up to the union. Whereas Taft actually made the rules that allowed for people to be able to go into a profession that required it. The Taft campaign is also where the precursors of the Paleo-Cons, who are the anti-Buckley faction, a lot of them are Taft Republicans. So Russell Kirk worked on the campaign, Robert Taft, to my knowledge. I believe that Paul Gottfried was a Taft Republican, but he was very young. But he was already a Taft Republican. And so on and so forth. The Republican Party at that point, again, very lost in the wilderness, goes with the candidate who is totally fine with the New Deal. The 1948 convention.
When it comes to the religious component to the conservatism of Buckley, was that also was that informed by the anti-communist aspect of his thought?
Yeah, so this is where conservatism in the U.S. gets kind of interesting, because so Taft actually opposes NATO, opposes the creation of NATO, he opposes the Korean War. But then there's this new crop of conservatives. Buckley is one of them, who are very pro Cold War. They want it. They want to fight the Cold War. It was Eisenhower that defeated Taft at the convention, not in the primaries. The religious component, the best way to sort of view it is as a new thing in American politics, where Catholicism is very important, because you have an increasing number of Catholics who want to join the Republican Party. Up until that point, Catholics had always been Democrats in the United States, going all the way back to Jefferson. Eventually, this triumphs with Nixon, but Buckley is sort of a catalyst for this, because Buckley is really the first person who is Catholic, but also pro-intervention, pro the administrative state, but only to fight the Cold War.
What made the Catholics start to shift to the Republicans around that time?
Ethnic politics, really racial politics in the big cities. And then in addition, the Cold War. Catholics view the Cold War much more positively, because many of them are Polish Americans. But Buckley is sort of, the best way to understand Buckley is it would be like if Richard Spencer took over the Republican Party. And I don't mean that because Buckley's politics are like Richard Spencer. What I mean is here's like an elite educated person, but he's not really coming out of what had already existed. He's not really coming out of the old right milieu. He's coming out of something different. He's coming out of this sort of Catholic intellectual milieu at Yale, who, were becoming increasingly concerned about communism, but not in the Bircher way. They were concerned about communism overseas, whereas the Birchers were concerned about communism at home and not overseas, which is why one of the most fascinating episodes is when Buckley expels the John Birch Society from the conservative movement. Now, his justification is that they were anti-Semitic. This is kind of problematic, though, because Buckley himself indulges plenty of people who fit the bill as anti-Semitic, including one who I think literally joins the Nazi Party, Revillo Oliver, who also is from this sort of milieu, as well as, interestingly, George Lincoln Rockwell, who Buckley was actually somewhat friendly with, well past the point of that being an acceptable thing to be. They were, in fact, Buckley, I think at one point sends a priest to try to talk Rockwell off the ledge of being a Nazi. It ends poorly. Rockwell sends Buckley a letter where he's like, I'm in the actual trenches fighting communism. You can be in your ivory tower doing it. Something along those lines. I don't need your priest. We're doing our own thing to fight communism.
When was this? What year was this that happened?
This is 50s. They were friends. Like Buckley and George Lincoln Rockwell knew each other. But it's important to like contextualize this, not to like make an apologia for Buckley or say, but also not to say Buckley was a Nazi, in the sense that they both were Northeastern WASPs who had gone to Ivy League schools, which was a small world at that time. You know, like that was a sort of small insular community. You know, Rockwell had gone to Brown, Buckley had gone to Yale. So that, you know, there's a greater context to that.
Say one more thing, but then I think we want to pick up on Buckley and go through the latter half of the 20th century up until today in the second half for Patreon, maybe.
Yeah.
But go ahead and finish.
Buckley expels the John Birch Society from the conservative movement, allegedly on the grounds of anti-Semitism, but the real reason, and everybody who studied this knows this, is that the Birchers were against the Vietnam War. So the Birchers were the true continuation of the old right in a certain sense. They were continuing the anti-New Deal, and anti-interventionism abroad. And this is a very funny thing, because in the American popular imagination, people who were against the Vietnam were the dirty hippies, the new leftists. But actually, the SDS didn't know if it was going to support the anti-war movement. And if you look at the polling, the youth were the most pro-Vietnam War. And the largest officially anti-Vietnam War organization in the United States for quite a while was the John Birch Society. So, you know, the old Bob Dylan song where he says like the paranoid John Birch people and blah, blah, blah. Well, the John Birchers were actually more aligned with the position that the supposedly, you know, what in the popular imagination were the anti-war Vietnam War activists, than the, you know, young people in the street marching for this and that in the 60s.
All right. Well, why don't we leave it there, and then I'm going to send you another link for the Parrot Room. But thank you, Wyatt. I'll stop the recording here. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.